All right, guys, I think that's going to be enough. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Apologies to everybody who was dealing with the link issues. I know a couple of you were struggling and emailing me here in the last 10 minutes or so. Hopefully you're online and hearing this. I know I saw several names that I got emails from, so apologies for that. We'll work out whatever issue was for next month's meeting. But glad you all can make it. So we're going to go ahead and get started today. Um, So today's webinar is one of our advanced floodplain management concept webinars we're doing this month. So today's webinar is specifically on floodways and floodway encroachments. Hope you guys get some good info out of this. So let's get going. First off, we're going to do a couple housekeeping things. Just so everybody's on the same page. First off, I will note that everybody should be muted. If you are, thank you for that. Please stay that way. One of the reasons being is because we don't want to hear background noise or things like that trying to talk over some of these, because we are recording them and they are going to be posted onto the Kentucky Flood Risk YouTube page. Not sure when that's going to happen. I'm hoping to get it done kind of over Christmas. We'll see if that actually happens. If you have questions, I'm going to ask that you guys use the chat function of the Teams link to ask those. There will be a final Q&A at the end of the webinar where you can come off mute and ask me any questions you might have directly. But as we're going through, if you have questions that you want addressed, go ahead and put them into that chat box. I'm monitoring on a second screen so I can address those as needed, or if you have a question about something maybe we haven't reached, I'll tell you to hold on to that or something like that. But use that chat function. Similarly, I'm going to ask that you guys don't use the raise hand function. Reason being is I only have two computers up and running, and I only have so many screens I can monitor while also presenting. So it is just me. It is a one-man band show here today. So if you need anything, use the chat. Please don't raise your hand. And then the last thing I'm going to ask you guys to do is, while I'm talking here, if you could, just to make sure I'm coming through for everybody, please go into the chat and type in your name and what community you're from, or what community you're the floodplain manager for. Again, this is just to verify that I'm not talking to myself, clicking through slides that y'all can't hear. So while you guys are doing that, I'm starting to see those come in, which is great. So I'm going to go to the next slide because it's pretty simple and straightforward while you guys are typing. So one of the things that always bothers me when you see these types of presentations, this is a federal, it is a state program. There are lots and lots of acronyms. One of the things I'm going to try and do today is I'm going to try and actually say the acronym out loud. If I slip up and I start just saying the acronyms themselves, and you're not sure what it is I'm talking about, please don't hesitate to say something in the chat for me. Remind me. But again, I'm going to try and say those out loud as we go. The other thing I want to share presentation notes wise is there is a guide that FEMA has for floodplain management requirements. It is their desk reference. I will note that this guide is a little dated at this point. It's going on almost 20 years old. But thankfully for the floodway specifically, we were able to use it to kind of illustrate some of the concepts. So if you're interested, I included the link to the guide. The units 3, 4, and 5 include a lot of the floodway information that we're going to be kind of talking about and sharing today in this presentation. All right, so quick outline. What are we going to be talking about? So I always start with the same introduction slides, just to kind of reemphasize why we're doing what we're doing, why it is important. But then we're going to get into the background of the floodway. What is it? Where did it come from? Why are we using it? That kind of thing. We're going to dig into what are the floodway requirements, both at the federal, the state, and the local levels, because there are different levels of jurisdiction when we're talking about the floodplain management programs. So we're going to dig into those requirements. Then we're going to talk about actually permitting an encroachment into the floodway. So what are the processes, both at the state level and at the local level, because those are the two that actually issue permits. What are the processes that we're going through? What are we looking for? What are we requiring the person applying to submit? Things like that. We're going to talk about updating the floodplain maps. So there is a process when we're talking about encroaching in a floodway where you can cause an impact. That you just have to go through the map updates. So we'll talk about what that looks like. And then we're going to talk about some best practices, and I'm going to show you guys some examples of some good floodway use and things like that there towards the end. So again, if you have questions as we go through any of this, guys, please ask them in the chat. All right. So diving right in, let's talk through the introduction. So again, if any of you have ever seen a presentation from me, I always start with these slides because they're important. So why do we care about floodplains? Floodplains are just inherently dangerous areas. They're the maps that we look at are actually a probability map. It's showing us where a flood is most likely to occur, right? So anything in the floodplain is considered to have high flood risk. From 1996 through 2020, that's about a 25-year period. Kentucky had 100 flood deaths, which is significant when you look at that same period because, we had about 1% of the U.S. population, but we accounted for about 4.5% of all of the flood deaths in that 25-year period. If you bring that period all the way up until the end of 2024, essentially today, that number would be well over 150, just because during the Eastern Kentucky floods there in 2022, we lost more than 40 people due to flood-related deaths. And you can tell by the map there at the bottom, there's no one part of Kentucky that has more or less flood risk, right? It really is a Commonwealth-wide issue. So, a little background on the NFIP because that's the program we're working under. The National Flood Insurance Program is a voluntary program that no community has to join. About 90%, a little over 90% of Kentucky communities are in the National Flood Insurance Program, but it is voluntary, right? So not all communities are within. When you join the program, though, your community basically agrees to adopt and enforce your floodplain management ordinance, basically saying, in our community, here's what we're going to make you do in these high-risk zones to protect yourself. We're going to make you elevate. We're going to make you use certain materials. We're going to make you make your building watertight or whatever. It's basically saying, here's how we're going to manage our community's flood risk. In return for that, the federal government makes federally backed flood insurance available to any property owner in that community, regardless of are they in the high risk zones or not. Anywhere it rains, it can flood. So insurance is available to everybody in the community. There are other funding opportunities that are directly tied to, being within the National Flood Insurance Program. Some examples would be grant funding through either things like HUD, EPA, Army Corps, FEMA, things like that. You can't spend federal dollars in your high risk zones if you're not managing the risk in those high risk zones. The federal government's not going to invest in your community if you're not taking, some minimum actions to protect it. The goal of the program, we want to reduce future flood damages moving forward, and there's 4 primary actions that it takes to kind of accomplish this goal. First one being, we got to identify those high-risk zones. That's our floodplain maps. Once we know where those zones are, then we're going to regulate development. So in those high-risk zones, you have to do X, Y, or Z to kind of protect yourself. No matter how high you set those standards, though, there's always a level of residual risk that we can never make go away. So they provide insurance to help cover that level of residual risk. So even though your house might be built where you're several feet above the base flood elevation, if something washes downstream during a flood and bangs into your foundation, that's still flood damages. So that insurance really is there to kind of make you whole after a flooding event. And then the last thing is we mitigate existing risk. So, there's been European settlers living in Kentucky for more than 200 years. This program's only about 55 or so years old. So, for all those structures that were in place when the NFIP was stood up, what do we do about them? We're going to mitigate. We're going to take an action to reduce their existing risk moving forward. And then, all of those legs, all of those actions are important to supporting the NFIP. If you're missing any one piece of this puzzle, it really does become an unbalanced program, and it does really kind of fall apart quickly. We typically show this example of a 4-legged stool, where each one of those legs, if you took one away, it's going to topple over. All right. So that's our introduction. Let's start talking about floodway specifics. So now that we all kind of have the same footing, what are we talking about when we're saying floodplain or floodway specifically? So the floodplain, that's pretty simple. It's pretty straightforward, pretty intuitive. Floodplain is the low-lying area adjacent to a river or stream that is subject to periodic flooding. It really is kind of the overflow valve when it comes to um, you know uh, uh, water flowing during a high flow event. Typical stream, within the banks of a typical stream or river, you can typically contain anywhere from a 1.5 to a 2 year storm event, meaning a storm big as you would expect to only get about every other year. Um, we regulate in under the National Flood Insurance Program up to the 100-year event, so significantly more water, and that water has to go somewhere, and it essentially overtops the banks and spreads out across the plain. That's our floodplain. When we're talking about the floodway, though, it's still a portion of the floodplain, but it's a very specific portion or a very specific section of the floodplain. The floodway is typically the area closest to the stream. The floodway typically is the area of a floodplain that carries the most water during those flood events. Those waters typically flow at higher velocities, because the water is typically deeper and it's experiencing less friction across the bottom or the banks of the stream or something like that. So, the deeper that water gets, the less friction it experiences, and typically the faster it can flow. So the floodway really is the most dangerous portion of the floodplain during some of those high flows events. So when it comes to, mapping that risk or identifying our flood risk, FEMA is the one ultimately responsible for producing and updating and maintaining all of the flood insurance rate maps, or what we commonly call floodplain maps, for everything in Kentucky. Now, Division of Water, we're a longtime cooperating technical partner with FEMA, which essentially means we kind of subcontract that from FEMA. Um, we still create the maps to FEMA specs. FEMA still funds for those updates and those reviews. But Division of Water, we're the ones doing a lot of the legwork. We're the ones doing a lot of the communication and the public meetings and things like that. So we're essentially a subcontractor for FEMA for the map updates. On the flood insurance rate maps, again, this is pretty common, but they're going to show you the area of 1% chance or greater of flood. So that's our, what we typically call our 100-year floodplain. That's shown in blue on the map there to the right. Other things that are pretty common, though, on these flood maps are going to be your regulatory floodways. So those are typically only found in Zone AE. That is shown there in the center of that map with the blue and red kind of colored hash mark. That's the floodway for that portion of the Kentucky River. In AE zones, you'll typically also find base flood elevations. You'll typically find the 0.2% chance floodplain is what they used to call the 500-year floodplain. That's that beige gold there kind of on the edge of the 100-year. And then you also find things like community landmarks, like corporate boundaries, county boundaries. You'll find things like streets, highways, interstates, things of that nature, things that kind of help you reference or relate in your mind where you're at in your community. Once these floodplains are identified on the flood insurance rate maps or the floodplain maps, those are the areas where we're going to start regulating development. So once you move into that second leg of the NFIP stool, once you start regulating your development, everything shaded in blue or blue-red, that's the area where permits are required. That's the area where flood insurance is mandatory if you have a federally backed loan, things like that. So specifically, when we're starting to get into the floodway, talking about what it is, before I kind of show you how they get to what a floodway is and how they create it, I kind of want to give you a little background on it first. So within the floodway, again, that's a very specific portion of the floodplain. Nothing can be put in the floodway that's going to cause any rise in base flood elevation. That's typically the easiest way to think about the floodway is you can do whatever you want in that area. You just have to be able to show that what you're doing isn't going to cause a rise. Because remember, floodway is the area that floods first, fastest velocities, deepest water. It's generally that most dangerous area of the floodplain during a flood event. So the floodways are very, I shouldn't say very, they're more restrictive than the rest of the floodplain, just simply because they're typically more dangerous. Anybody wanting to do work within the floodway has to hire a professional engineer, or what we commonly refer to as a PE, that has to do an engineering analysis, basically, again, showing their work. It's not just enough to say, oh, well, this is such a little project and the river's so big. You have to be able to show your work to show that what you're doing isn't going to cause a rise. So the professional engineer that the property owner hires, they have to submit some data to Division of Water. So that's going to be your hydraulic models, basically showing that work. So basically showing your proposed conditions. What are you wanting to do on that piece of property in the floodway? They have to show those models to us as part of their permit application process. And then they also have to complete a no-rise certificate form, which we'll talk about much more whenever we get into the actually permitting the encroachment later on. So where did these floodways come from? Well, that's a long story, and um, floodways early on were really they were a simple solution to a very complex problem, and I'm going to show you that by kind of going through a little timeline here. So 1968, the National Flood Insurance Act was passed by Congress. That act was actually part of the Housing and Urban Development Act. This act essentially stood up the National Flood Insurance Program in 1968. It established, what the program was about. It established some of the carrot and stick parts of the program that we've talked about, such as, communities in managing their local flood risk while the federal government makes insurance available and ties grant dollars to it and things like that. So it established that, but it also established some basic floodplain and floodway regulations in that original 1968 Act. About 10 years later, 1977, President Carter signed Executive Order 11988. This is one of the primary guiding documents that kind of has shaped everything we do floodplain management related ever since. So in this executive order, President Carter basically said to provide for the discharge of the base flood, or what we now call the 100-year flood, so that a cumulative increase in water surface elevation is no more than a designated amount. Basically saying, this was basically the first recognition of, okay, if you have very, very strict floodplain requirements, you're essentially making those parts of your communities unbuildable, right? So we don't want to do that. We want to allow for some level of development in these areas because, they are beautiful areas. People want to typically live or work near water. There are a lot of, companies specifically that have to be near water sources, either for transportation or for heating and cooling or other means. So we don't want to restrict any development from the floodplains, but we also don't want to go gangbusters either. We want to do something that's reasonable. So we're in this executive order, he basically said, okay, we're going to set the maximum allowable increase at a designated amount. The executive order didn't actually say what that amount was yet, but it was the first recognition of there needs to be an upper limit to how much development we allow in some of these more sensitive areas along our streams and rivers in the floodways. President Carter, when he signed this, he ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to do a study to basically settle on what that designated amount was. In 1978, the following year, they released that study that basically set the floodway target at the 1 foot allowable rise that we kind of have today. So you can develop in the floodplain and cause up to 1 foot of rise without running afoul of the floodplain regulations. Okay. Couple years later, 1984, this is after FEMA was created. So they were the ones kind of managing the National Flood Insurance Program at this point instead of HUD. This is also where we started to get to the point where we had good enough data where they, instead of just creating boundary maps, they started creating the first actual flood insurance rate maps. So those are the first step in the maps we're still using today. So in the mid 80s is kind of where you started hitting the point where there was enough data and there was enough confidence in the data and the engineering that they started putting the floodway boundaries on the flood insurance rate maps. Once that happened, once it's on the floodplain map, the only way it can be removed is by either a letter of map change or a floodplain map update. So once it's on, the floodway is on the map, we're going to be using it probably in perpetuity unless there's some major change to the National Flood Insurance Program. So once a floodway is on the map, it's pretty much there. Over time, though, we started, floodplain managers started realizing some of the issues and some of the limitations with, using floodways as they were originally designed. Once you start hitting the 2000s, the 2010s, the data has caught up to, some of those engineering challenges so that, some of the initial challenges when they were first setting these floodway targets no longer really existed. Now we have the computer modeling, we have the software to do it, we have the data out there to do it. So the Association of State Floodplain Managers did a national review of flood programs and policies, and what they basically found was that allowing current FEMA standards for the floodway causes increased peaks whenever floods happen. So that again, you're allowing all this development in the floodplain, and development typically means impervious surfaces. So you see greater peaks, meaning greater elevations of the flood elevations. You see additional flood damages because again, you're allowing folks to develop in these high risk zones, and you're promoting essentially the filling of some of these riparian areas. Riparian meaning some of the green space areas along streams or rivers. Again, people want to live close to water, and when you lose those riparian areas, you're also damaging not just your floodplain, meaning it may not store as much water as it did before, but you're also losing other ecological benefits. You're dealing with water quality issues at that point, things of that nature. So how do we actually calculate a floodway? So now that we kind of know where they came from, let's talk about how when our risk map team actually goes through and updates the floodplain maps, how do they actually get to a floodway on the map? Before we can calculate a floodway, the first thing we have to figure out is what's our base flood elevations. So when we're looking at that, there's two primary factors that can influence your community's base flood elevations. First one is going to be essentially our stream flow amounts or our rainfall. So basically the amount of water or how much water and how it falls kind of across the watershed. That's our hydrology. That's essentially the study of how water falls again across the landscape. Once it's on the ground, where does it go? So that's primarily dictated by our topography or our ground elevations. So how water flows across the ground is the study of hydraulics. So if you typically hear us say you have to hire an engineer to do an H&H study or we need the hydrology report or the hydraulics report or something like that, that's essentially what we're talking about, is the study of how much water is falling on an area and how does it flow once it reaches the ground. Those are the two primary factors that we're looking at. All of that leads us to our stream channel. And again, I mentioned this before, but a typical stream within the banks of a channel can hold anywhere from a 1.5 or a 2-year storm event. Again, though, the National Flood Insurance Program, we regulate up to the 100-year. So where does that water go if it can't stay within the banks of the stream? Well, it's going to spread and it's going to go up and out. So once we know approximately how much water is flowing through an area at a certain point, we can do a probability analysis. We can do a probability. I think it's a regression analysis is its actual term. They do a gauge analysis. There's a lot of different ways, but they've essentially figured during that 1 in 100 chance flood, how much water is going to be flowing past a given point. And then where does that water spread out? That's our topography. Once you have those two things, you essentially have your base flood elevation. So that's how high we expect the water to get during that 100-year flood. The extent of that base flood elevation as it spreads out across the landscape, that is our 1% chance floodplain. That is the floodplain we regulate. Basically, everything that's shaded in blue is areas of the community that we expect to be covered either partially or fully during that 100-year flood. So you might have, 1/10 of an inch, or you might have 10 feet of water. But it doesn't matter. If you're in an area that's shaded blue on the floodplain maps, that is an area we expect to see some level of water during that 1 in 100 chance flood. Um, Once you have your base flood elevation, the next thing we have to do is we have to remember what our floodway requirements are. So the floodway, again, um, it's basically set up where you can cause up to that 1 foot cumulative rise on a stream without running afoul of the federal regulations. So when we're calculating a floodway, what we're going to do essentially is we're essentially going to squeeze this landscape until we cause a 1 foot rise in the base flood elevation. So the way it's done is nowadays it's all done in a computer, but we basically simulate some level of encroachment where either we raise the ground elevations up above the BFE, or we put fill in, or they create a flood wall or some other type of impermeable barrier, where essentially we're squeezing and squeezing and squeezing on our floodplain. Well, when that happens, you're losing a lot of the storage that you previously had where those simulated encroachments are on the left and right side of the floodplain. Well, when the water can't spread out, there's only one way for it to go, and so it goes up. And then they keep essentially squeezing that floodway or that floodplain, excuse me, until they hit that 1 foot allowable rise. That 1 foot allowable rise is also commonly called a surcharge. It's basically the upper limit again of what you can do under the regulations without running afoul of them. So um, once you have that 1 foot allowable rise, everything between those 2 points where that simulated encroachment was occurring, that's going to be our regulatory floodway. So again, that 1 foot allowable rise that the NFIP allows is already calculated when you're looking at the floodplain maps in the floodway. That floodway is the area that has to be reserved to allow the 1% chance flood to flow past without causing more than that 1 foot allowable rise. So you can see as you squeeze that floodplain, you get that 1 foot. Everything in between is our floodway. So you can see that the floodway, really, we're already calculating that in. You don't have to worry about that. Now, this is just a simulated encroachment. So we're not actually squeezing the floodplain. Again, this is all being done in a computer model. So our line AA, that blue line where our base flood elevation is, when you're looking at it on the map, again, that is still going to be the regulated floodplain. Everything that we expect to get wet during that 100-year flood still requires permits, still requires insurance if you have a federally backed mortgage, things like that. But you're able to actually develop out in what's called the flood fringe, meaning the area of the floodplain outside of the floodway. You're able to develop in those areas and not really have to worry about causing that 1 foot allowable rise. Because again, the computer model, when we created the floodplain that's used on the map, already has that rise baked into it in the floodway. So if you're out in the fringe, theoretically, there's nothing you can do that's going to cause more than that 1 foot allowable rise, as long as you don't get in the floodway. I don't see any questions or anything in the chat. Hopefully this makes sense, guys. I tried to distill this down in such a way that it was going to be pretty easy for those of you who aren't engineering or maybe math nerds or whatever. So if you have any questions about how we get to calculating the floodway, please let me know in the chat. But I don't see any yet, so I'm going to go ahead and keep moving. But this is essentially how they calculate the floodway. They calculate the base flood elevation, they squeeze it until they hit the allowable rise, and then everything between those 2 points of the encroachment, that becomes our floodway. That's the area that we're going to reserve to make sure we can pass the 100-year storm event. All right, so let's dive into, now that we know kind of the history of the floodway and what some of the requirements, or excuse me, how they get to what it looks like on the map, let's start talking about some of the floodway requirements. So there's three levels of regulation that all kind of feed together in the National Flood Insurance Program: the federal, the state, and local. We're going to start with the federal, and then we're going to move our way over to the local, kind of as we go through with this. Hopefully, what you're going to see. Hopefully, what you're going to see with this is a lot of these regulations are identical or nearly identical across all levels. So starting out with the federal requirements, the Code of Federal Regulations, CFR, that is actually where we find our regulations. So Part 40, Chapter 44 of the Code of Federal Regulations, Part 59 is the definitions for everything floodplain, floodway related. So in the definitions, they actually define what a regulatory floodway is. It is the channel of a river or watercourse and the adjacent areas that have to be reserved to discharge the 100-year flood without cumulatively increasing the water elevations more than that 1 foot allowable height. That's what our floodway is. Again, hopefully you saw that visually on the last couple slides as we were kind of going through. But this is the area of the floodplain that we have to reserve to make sure that any development we do doesn't increase surface elevations more than that 1 foot allowable rise. The other part of the Code of Federal regulations is Part 60. That's actually where the federal regulations live as far as what's allowable in the floodplain, depending on what level of map detail you have. So 44 CFR Part 60.3 D3 is actually where it talks about encroaching on the floodway. So it prohibits encroachments, fill, new construction, or substantial improvements and other development within the floodway unless it has been demonstrated through H&H analysis that a encroachment would not result in an increase in flood levels during the base discharge. Again, you can do whatever you want in the floodplain, but you have to show through that hydraulic and hydrologic analysis that your engineer does that it's not going to cause that rise. If you're interested, I included the link to the CFRs there at the bottom. You're welcome to read through it. Yeah. All right, moving on from the federal, let's talk about what some of the state requirements are. So Kentucky, we actually have a state statute that gives us statewide permitting authority. So those are our Kentucky revised statutes. That's what's actually passed by the legislature. So KRS 151-250 is actually our state permitting authority. It basically says no person, city, county, or other political subdivision of the state shall develop in any area adjacent to a river or stream or in the floodway of the stream unless plans and specifications for work have been submitted and a permit issued. So basically, this is where we go back to anytime people say, I don't need a permit or I'm not in the floodplain. We have authority to kind of make that call. Along with that, we also so Kentucky's unique. I talked earlier about how in the NFIP, it's a voluntary program. No community has to join. Well, because we have statewide permitting authority, we actually are able to issue floodplain permits in every community across Kentucky, whether your local community participates or not. And part of that authority, 151-320, says that the community CEO shall enforce with the cabinet the provisions of 151-250 and any of the regulations issued along with it. So whether your community participates or not is going to dictate whether or not you have to issue any local permits. The state permit applies, though, regardless of if your local community joins or not. So the statutes are, again, that's what's passed by the legislature. So that's kind of where we're going. The regulations, though, the administrative regs, that's how we're going to get there. Title 401 of the Kentucky Administrative Regulations, Chapter 4, Part 60, basically says this reg applies to all construction in the floodway of a stream. So these regs are basically setting the limits statewide, or I should say the minimum limits statewide for floodway development. Specifically talking about floodway encroachments, though, our state regs basically say all encroachments including fill, new construction, substantial improvements or other developments are prohibited unless the encroachment shall have no impact nor result in any increase in flood elevation. So again, hopefully you're starting to see that these regs are kind of repeating themselves at all three levels. They're pretty similar across the board. Still don't see any questions, so we're going to move on. So for the local ones, for the next couple slides, I actually included the citations from your local ordinance. So if you're interested in going to look at this information and your community uses the state model ordinance, which I would say is about 90% of you, you should be able to use these citations and go straight to this point in your ordinance. Some of you, though, like Lexington, Versailles, Woodford County, some of the ones where your ordinance is baked into maybe your planning and zoning ordinance or something like that. The citations might be different, but all of the information we're going to talk about should be in your local ordinance somewhere. If it's not, please let me know immediately, and we can get your ordinance amended to include it. So your local ordinance includes a floodway definition, just the same as the state and federal do. Channel of a river or watercourse and the adjacent area that has to be reserved in order to discharge base flood without cumulatively increasing water surface elevation. Again, the definitions are pretty much identical across the board. There are a couple other definitions specific to floodways in your local ordinances, such as floodway fringe, or what's the difference between a regulatory floodway and the floodway is really nothing. They kind of are both defined identically in your ordinance, and they also refer to each other. So it's kind of a closed loop of definitions. Outside of the definitions, though, in your ordinance, Article 4 is essentially where your ordinance says, here are the jobs and duties we kind of expect the local floodplain manager to do. So Section C2 of that article basically says, review and use any other base flood data. Floodplain administrators shall obtain, review, and reasonably utilize any base flood elevation and floodway data available from federal or state agency or other source. Now, you're not required to use data from another source if you don't feel comfortable for it. Again, reasonably utilize. But if we have a professional engineer submitting a model to us, that's one where we should review it and reasonably utilize it. But again, just because somebody gives you something that says, oh, this won't cause a rise, and it's just a letter typed up or something, we don't have to use that. It's reasonably utilized. Article 5 of your ordinance is actually where you start to get into the actual development requirements. So in your community, here are the standards that we're going to require folks to meet if they're in the floodway. So B5 specifically talks about floodways, and it says we're going to prohibit encroachments unless certification with supporting technical data by a registered professional engineers provided demonstrating that it shall not increase the base flood elevations. Again, the standards are pretty much identical, but your ordinance specifically says we're going to prohibit encroachment unless you can prove to us that what you're doing isn't going to cause a rise. Other parts of your ordinance specifically talking about floodways. Article 5, Section G is talking about critical facilities. Now, critical facilities can be a little bit of a broad term because what's critical to one community may not be critical to another. Give you a great example is there was a community kind of north of Frankfurt, I forget which county specifically, but for them, one of their critical facilities was actually their school bus depot. Their plan was, in the event of a flood, to use that to evacuate areas of the town, such as the school or the assisted living home and things like that. But what they realized when they were going through is that the school bus depot is actually in the floodplain as well. So you might be without those if you don't evacuate your school buses. So again, what a critical facility is can change community to community. But in the ordinance specifically, it says construction of a new critical facility is not permissible in the floodway. Period. Full stop. There's not really an exemption for that. You can still put one in the floodplain, but your local ordinances basically say critical facilities are not allowed in the floodway, period. And then the last part of your ordinance I want to talk about when it comes to floodways is actually a variance. So there is a variance procedure. We're not dictators. We're not telling people you have to do this no matter what. There is an appeal. There is a variance procedure in your ordinance. But your conditions for variances when we're talking about floodways basically flat out say a variance shall not be issued within a mapped regulatory floodway if an increase in flood levels would result. So even though there is an appeal and variance procedure, your appeals board cannot issue a variance if it's going to cause a rise in BFE in the floodway, period. Again, full stop. All right. Don't see any questions. So guys, we're going to keep kind of rolling right along. So if you do have something, please ask it in the chat. All right. So now we know what our requirements are. We know how floodways are calculated. Let's actually start talking about how do we get to the permitting the encroachment side. First thing we got to remember is, if your community's in the National Flood Insurance Program, and I think everybody on here, your community is in. I'm pretty sure I didn't see any random or rogue names on here, but your local community is required to issue permits to ensure that any proposed development in the floodplain or floodway meets your local ordinance requirements. Reason this is done is because you know your community better than I do sitting in Frankfurt. I know Kentucky better than anybody sitting in the Region 4 a FEMA office in Atlanta, or in some of their DC offices or anything like that. You guys know your community better than anybody else. So final authority to decide what can or can't happen in your community is left up to you. Now, we run into this more frequently than I really like, but there are some communities who seem to think that as long as they get the state permit, they're fine. As long as they get their state floodplain permit, we don't really have to do anything, even though we're in the National Flood Insurance Program, and it doesn't actually work that way. Every single state permit that we issue, every one that goes out the door, if your community participates, has a condition on it that says, Perry County, Franklin County, City of Frankfurt, whatever, participates in the National Flood Insurance Program. As such, a local permit's required. If you don't get a local permit, the state permit becomes null and void. So if they get the state permit, but they don't come to you and get local sign off, the state permit actually doesn't do them any good. So they definitely need to come to talk to you all before they begin any development. Communities, you guys are the ones ultimately responsible for reviewing applications. So have them submit something to you in writing, kind of giving you a project narrative. What are you doing? How are you doing it? What materials? How are you going to make sure you're not causing a rise? Things like that. Have them give you an application stating all of that. And then based on what they put on the application, we're either going to approve or deny the proposed project when we compare that to our floodplain ordinance. Local officials, you guys can request assistance from Division of Water. You can actually email me directly, or you can email our DOW floodplain@ky.gov email address and just tell them you're looking for assistance when issuing a floodplain or a floodway permit or something like that. We're happy to help. We're doing this kind of informally now. Eventually, there's going to be an actual technical review process that we're going to go through once our new state regulations go into place. Hopefully later next year is when those will actually go into effect. That's our current timeline. That's kind of what we're hoping for. But for now, you can, again, just email us. We're happy to help you. It's pretty common for new floodplain managers that I kind of sit and go through the review process with them on the first couple, and then I check their work on the next handful before I kind of turn them loose to start working on their own. That's pretty common. So if you have questions, if you need assistance, don't hesitate, reach out. We're here to help. All right, so let's actually talk about the encroachment options. There's several ways you can actually encroach in the floodway. Some of them are very small, very simple. Some of them are very large and can be very complex. But there's different levels of encroachment options that we can look at. A couple of them are very simple for you guys as floodplain managers, but two of them are the ones where we do need to spend a little more time and a little more effort. So I'm going to go through these with you guys to kind of lay this out a little bit. So the first one we're interested in would be what's essentially a no impact, meaning we're going to do something in the floodway that's not going to cause any change in the water surface elevations, in the floodway extent, or in the floodway width that's going to make any change from what's published in your community's flood insurance study. Um, Options of this would be things like walking trails, green sinks, riparian areas, or you could do something simple like general property maintenance. I have a couple trees, on a part of my yard that I think needs to come out, or I'm trimming bushes or planting trees, ag actions, planting corn or beans or tobacco or whatever. Those would all be things where while you're doing something in the floodway, you're not causing any impact to any of the elevations or what's actually mapped for the floodway. The second one is the one that's probably the most common. This is where we're going to get into a lot of detail over the next couple slides. So this is where we're actually talking about no rise situations. So you're doing something it's not going to be a no impact, but what you're going to be able to do is you're going to be able to show no rise, meaning 0.00 feet, 2 decimal points. That 2 decimal points is very important. That's the FEMA standard that you have to be able to meet. So when you think back to your middle school or your junior high algebra, when you're talking about rounding, um, any impact with 0.004 or less would round down. So for that, we would actually consider 0.004 to be a no rise, because at a certain point that the impact or the change you're causing is so minimal that it's literally unmappable. We cannot update the floodplain map based on 4/1000ths of a foot. But if you have a change or an impact that's 0.005, that would round up. And at that point, you're not able to show no rise to 2 decimal points anymore, because 0.005 would round up to 0.01, which is not showing no rise to 2 decimal points. So no rise is essentially where we are causing some very, very minor impact. But again, at a certain point, it becomes unmappable on the floodplain maps. A decrease in the water surface elevations might also be a no rise. Again, you're not causing no impact. You might be decreasing the water surface elevations when you install a detention basin, for example, or a below ground swimming pool, or something like that, where you're actually creating additional storage. But again, it's not a no impact. So that's where we typically call it no rise. The third encroachment option is the big one. This is where a map change is actually required. So again, we've talked this whole time about you can only cause up to a 1 foot cumulative rise in the floodplain and a no rise in the floodway. If you have to do something that's going to cause more than that allowable impact on one of those, you can still do it, but you have additional hurdles that you have to go through, which is you have to go through the conditional letter of map revision process before you even apply for your floodplain permit. Give you a great example of this. So Kentucky Transportation Cabinet and IDOT, the Indiana Department of Transportation, are both kind of working together to complete the I-69 bridge going across the Ohio River there in Henderson County in kind of western Kentucky. On the Indiana side, they have something like a 2-mile wide floodway. And really early on, their highway engineers realized there's no way we can over design this and stick within our budget to not cause an impact. So instead, what they've been working on for the past couple years is actually going through the CLOMAR process, the conditional letter of map revision, which basically says, okay, we're going to cause, in this example, I think it's 0.15 foot rise in the floodway. So it's about an inch and a half of a rise. What FEMA's doing through this CLOMAR review before they ever start, turning dirt, is they're basically mapping and looking at that impact and saying, okay, here are the houses that are potentially impacted based on this rise that you need to do that's not normally allowed. So what we need you to do beforehand is we need you to go to these property owners and either acquire their property or to do some type of financial settlement where they will agree to assume that additional risk, or you have to do some level of mitigation or work during that conditional process before you ever actually apply for a permit to do the work. So again, you can cause a rise in a floodway. It's just a lot more difficult. It's also a little confusing, which is why we typically just tell folks in the floodway, no rise is allowed. Period. That's not wholly accurate, but again, it's difficult. It's also not cheap. Just the fees alone, not the cost of the engineer, not the cost of getting the model done, not any application costs or anything. Just the fees for submitting the CLOMAR LOMAR can be anywhere from $10,000 to $15,000. So you can pretty quickly see why this is something that would deter most individual property owners. But communities, the transportation cabinet, bigger organizations, that might be a cost they're willing to assume to kind of accomplish some of these. So the big one is the map change required, where you actually have to physically go through the CLOMAR process. Then you get your permit, then you do the project, and then you finish up with the actual letter of map revision. The LOMAR is what actually updates the floodplain maps on the back end. So you submit your as-builts to them. And then the last one, and this is one that not a lot of folks know about, but there are certain impacts or encroachments that you can do in the floodway that don't require a study. These are what's termed minor projects, and we're going to talk about those on, I believe, the next slide a little more in detail. But these are for very small things, again, that are not going to cause any rise or any impact to the floodway, even though a study might be required. So you can see there's big impacts and there's little impacts based on this list. But again, the two most common that you're going to be dealing with are the top two, the no impact and the no rise. Those are the ones we're going to most commonly encounter. For flood, if I'm a local floodplain manager, the no study needed one, even though you're in the floodway, we can just permit it with the normal process without requiring a study. For the big one, for the map change required, that's something FEMA and their engineers are going to be doing. So again, all we really need is the CLOMAR letter from them. It's pretty simple when you're doing one of those two. But for the no impact and the no rise, we do require a little bit more information on the application. We do require the form be signed and submitted, things like that. All right, so when we're looking at a no rise analysis, and this is specific to Division of Water, but it should also apply to your local programs as well. I'm going to tell you kind of what we do so that you can understand and apply that to your local processes. So when we require a no-rise analysis, we require that the applicant or the person applying and their engineer submit 4 hydraulic models to us to be reviewed. The first one is the effective model. This is the model that we used whenever we created the floodplain map that you see online or on the paper maps everywhere. Again, we created a model when we updated the maps. That model is still available. You just have to let us know you need it. So the first thing we want is we want you to give us a copy of the effective model, because again, that's anything you're doing later on in this process is all based on using that effective model, having that correct starting point. Next model that we want is a duplicate effective. We want you to take that effective model and rerun it. And we want to make sure that the outputs are identical. We want to make sure that there's nothing missing, that a number didn't get transposed or something like that. We basically want you to duplicate that model to just show that you're still getting the same outputs before you do any corrections or anything like that. Third one is we want to correct it effective. So when you're typically developing in these areas, again, it's not a cheap process to develop in the floodway. So typically you're going to have things like site plans, design drawings. You're going to have maps. You're going to have additional surveys. You're going to have cross sections. You might have LiDAR data. There's a lot of different ways where you can improve on these effective models to actually show what the existing conditions on the ground are today. We want you to take any of that information that you have access to and actually do it. We want to make these models as accurate as we can make them. So whatever data you have, plug it into these models, rerun it, and that would be your corrected effective model. And then the last one is going to be your proposed conditions. So now once we have actually what's going on the ground, in the model. Now tell us what you're going to do. Are you going to build a building? Are you going to be doing grading operations? Are you going to be doing fill? What are you actually doing? Show us your proposed conditions, so we can kind of see what you're wanting to do on this piece of property. Um, this sounds really complicated. It's actually not as hard as you would think. Reason being is those first two models that we require, those are pretty simple. Again, we have access to all of the floodplain, excuse me, we have access to almost all of the floodplain models in Kentucky. Again, being the cooperating technical partner now for going on almost 20 years, we have most of the models. You can get all of the Zone A models from the flood hazard portal, but Zone AE or sinkhole models, we still have those. You just have to do a model request where you sent an email to this kyriskmap@ky.gov. Give me a good lat long, and we'll be able to give you the model, the effective model, that was used for that stream, and then basically just rerun it. Again, those first two are pretty simple. It's the corrected, effective, and proposed conditions, where the professional engineer that the person applying hires, where they're going to have to do that additional legwork. Some other things we typically require that they submit along with these four models would be things like a project narrative. Give us a good description of how you're going to be building it. Is it going to be done all at once? Is it going to be done in phases? Are there going to be areas of temporary impact versus areas of permanent impact? What materials are you using? What elevations? The project narrative really needs to paint us a full picture of what and how they're wanting to do. We typically require some type of topographic work map, so show me a map with cross sections or design drawings or something, so we can actually see if you have cross section plots, or if they have again a detailed site survey or something like that. We want that. We want all of that submitted as part of the application, so that we can review it and use that to decide whether or not a permit's needed. So all of this should be submitted as part of their application package. During the review, state and local floodplain managers, there's a couple things we need to be doing. This applies a little more to the local managers more than the state, but this is something we should all be thinking about whenever we're looking at a floodway encroachment. So first thing we need to do, again, and this has been kind of a recurring theme this entire webinar, is we have to ensure that what they're proposing is not going to cause a rise or an impact, not just at the project site, but upstream and downstream as well. If you put a bridge across a stream and you can show no rise where you're at, great. But if you're causing a rise upstream because water is all of a sudden maybe ponding a little more than it was previously or something like that, that's an impact that while at the actual site might not be impacted, we are going to be looking upstream and downstream. For the locals, review any submitted technical information to the best of your abilities. If you've not seen a design drawing, if you've not read cross-section, I'm trying to even think what the word is. If you've not looked at cross sections on a map and then looked at the cross sections on the designs and tried to piece together what it looks like 3D in your head, that's sometimes a difficult thing to do right out of the gate. So review any of the technical information to the best of your abilities. But again, don't hesitate to reach out to us at Division of Water if you need help reviewing some of this. Again, we have professional engineers on staff who do floodplain management full time. That's all they do. So let us know if you need help kind of reviewing some of this information. And then the other thing you should be doing when we're ensuring no rise is we need to keep a record of all of the data they submit to us. That is what you're basing your decision off of. So make them give you copies of the models, even if you maybe can't open the models because you don't have the software on your end. Go ahead and get copies of it anyway. The other thing we need to do, along with the no rise, no impact analysis, is we also need a certificate from them. And this is where local programs typically rely more on, is getting a copy of this no rise, no impact certification. It has to be completed by a professional engineer. Again, it has to be done by a PE that's licensed in Kentucky. And we need to make sure the certification is both signed and stamped by the professional engineer. Typical engineering firms have a lot of what are I guess you'd just call them staff engineers, where they're people who are maybe fresher out of college or people who don't have their PE license, um, that do a lot of the general legwork, but it's all overseen by a professional engineer. As long as this is signed and stamped by a professional engineer, we're okay with it. But this form, this certification, is essentially where you're taking the engineer's word for it that what he did is up to engineering spec. It meets all of the standard requirements. It's not going to violate your ordinance. This is him putting his professional certification on the line to give you this form and say, this is not going to cause a rise or an impact based on this study, the analysis I did. That's the easiest way for you guys at the local level to make sure you're meeting your no rise requirements, is to make them give you a copy of this no rise certificate. Typically, they're going to come to you guys and get your permits after they've received the state permit. This is something we're requiring of them, so that it's not like they're going to have to create it. They just have to give you a copy. All right, I'm not seeing any questions, guys, so I'm going to keep chugging along. But if you have something, there will be a Q&A here in a little bit. All right. So those no rise exemption requests that we were talking about earlier, we're talking about some of those small isolated obstructions that maybe don't rise to the level of requiring the hiring of a professional engineer, which a professional engineer typically is many thousands, if not tens of thousands of dollars pretty quickly to do one of these analysis. So for small isolated obstructions, FEMA does allow for an exemption request in their guidance. The term this guide uses is what they call a minor project. It does give some examples. So for things like an individual mailbox, roads, driveways, or parking lots at grade, not on top of grade, at grade, meaning you excavate a little bit of the topsoil material and then backfill with the either the asphalt, the pavement, or the gravel to create your parking lot or driveway. Something like that at grade. Open style fences, the examples they gave would be things like chain link fences, um, barbed wire fences, the type of wood fences that you typically see around horse farms, things like that. Those are all open style fences. And then things like single telephone poles, as long as the foundation's below ground. All of those would fall under the minor projects. So even though these projects might typically require a no rise, um, they can be permitted without one, but the person doing the work has to ask for this exemption. It's not something we're going to automatically give to them. They do have to make a request to us for it. The guidance I always tell people when we're talking about minor projects is, if you're not certain, and I mean certain, that it's a minor project, your default should always be to require that they complete a hydraulic analysis. Again, this is for things that we are positive are not going to cause any rise or impact on the floodplain. Even though a mailbox might be in the floodway, it would have to be a very, very small stream for that one pole to cause any kind of rise. So if you're not sure it's a minor project, always, always, always have them complete a hydraulic analysis. When it comes to making those requests for the state permit and for the local permit, the first thing I want to mention is Division of Water. We have a couple general permits that are out there. Neither of our general permits can be used in the floodway. So anytime they're doing work in the floodway, they're going to have to get an individual permit from us. General permits categorically exclude any work in the floodway. So when they submit for their state permit, their individual permit from Division of Water, they need to submit a request and their justification in writing on their application as to why they feel that consideration of an exemption is warranted. We reserve the right to require them to complete an H&H study at any time. So just because they feel that they deserve an exemption doesn't mean that we have to give it to them. If we feel uncertain, or if we feel certain that it is going to cause an impact, we can require an analysis at any time. Similarly, for your local permit when they are doing these minor projects in the floodway. They still have to come to you for a permit. They still need to submit their request and their justification in writing on their application whenever they submit for their local permit as to, again, why they feel that consideration of an exemption is warranted. You also have the authority, you reserve the right to require that H&H study at any time. So again, just because somebody feels like this is a minor project, I should, be getting an exemption, doesn't mean you necessarily have to give it to them. If you want to take a look at this guidance document and actually read a little bit more about minor projects, I included the link here. The November 2023 version is the most recent one I could find. It's about a year old now, but it has about a page and a half worth of guidance for what would be minor projects, what wouldn't be, things like that. All right, still seeing no questions, so we're going to keep chugging right along. All right, so let's talk about changing the floodplain maps. So let's think back to why we have the floodplain maps. Maps are really there to identify areas with high, moderate, and low risk of flooding. Notice I say low risk, not no risk, because anywhere it rains, it can flood. Even on the side of a hill or up on top of some of the mountains in eastern Kentucky. If you get a big enough rainfall event, anywhere can flood. These maps are used for making determinations, but they also help to communicate flood hazard or flood risk information to those citizens. So they tell you where the hazard's at. This is the area that we think is going to flood when the 100-year flood comes. We also use them for floodplain management decisions. So, is a permit needed? Yes or no? Lenders and their determination companies use them to determine when you're closing on a house as part of your mortgage documents whether or not you have to carry flood insurance. Lenders are required by law to make you carry insurance if you're in one of those high risk zones. And then they used to be used by insurance agents to help rate policies. That's not as done anymore since FEMA changed how they rate their premiums. But that's what they used to be used for as well. So when we're talking about actually changing the map, we understand that things are dynamic. The flood hazard information on your maps really are a snapshot in time. They're showing you the risk at the time the map was created. But the maps need to be updated to include any future changes as things go along. So how often has something like this happened where one day you're driving past an empty piece of property and it looks like the image to the right, and then you come by the same piece of property 6 months later and you're starting to see the installation of a subdivision or some other type of commercial event. Well, it's pretty clear that the top picture versus the bottom two have significantly different levels of flood risk. So, a Walmart or a corporate development or commercial development or a subdivision, all of those have much, much, much higher flood risk than an empty field that floods where nobody would really care except the cows living there or something like that. So as things change, the maps need to be updated. And there's two primary ways that FEMA baked into the map update process. So you have the map revisions that actually physically alter the maps themselves. This is what we do on kind of the watershed wide scale, or what they used to do on the county wide scale, where they updated all of the streams all at once for a particular watershed. For example, say the lower Kentucky River watershed or something like that. This is a very long process. There's a lot of engineering, there's a lot of quality assurance checks, and there's also a pretty extensive due process phase, meaning it has to be published in the Federal Register. There has to be a 90-day appeal and comment period. If there is any appeals, we have to incorporate them and do another 30-day appeal and comment period. It's a long process. Typically, when we do map updates, we can have the maps created in a year to a year and a half, but it takes anywhere from 3 to 5 years to actually finish the process due to all this due process. The other way we can update the maps is through the letter of map change, which is an administrative process that's kind of baked into this update. This is where we can look at individual properties or maybe segments of a stream or something like that, rather than the entire stream itself. We're only going to look at specific areas of impact. So there's a bunch of different letters that are actually used for this letter of map change process. I'm going to kind of go through them just so you kind of understand what the difference are between them. But there's a couple that are very specifically going to be used for floodway encroachments. The first one, the simplest, this is the one we see the most often, is the letter of map amendment, or LOMA, LOMA. This is for either typically single or adjoining lots, to remove them based on better data than what was in the floodplain model. So this would be something like where we think we know where the ground elevation is, and so we consider a house to be in, but then they submit an elevation certificate that says no, actually the elevation is 6 inches higher, which would put me out or something like that. That's a typical LOMA, letter of map amendment. You can also have an out as shown, meaning the lender's determination company made a mistake and they said you need flood insurance with your mortgage, when in reality you're not in the floodplain on the map. There's also a conditional letter of map amendment, CLOMA. Again, that's done kind of on the front end, before you ever actually do your building or development. The next one is the letter of map revision, LOMAR, LOMR. This is where we start getting into some of the bigger developments. So this is where we're talking about things like subdivisions, commercial developments, stream crossings for like roads and bridges, things of that nature. This is where we're actually starting to change how water flows across the landscape. So when you're putting in a subdivision, you're causing more impacts by that development process than you are for a house that's already existing that would be done under a LOMA, for example. The letter of map revision does again have that conditional process where you can kind of get pre-clearance through FEMA and say, okay, if you develop in this way, here's what our determination will be on the back end, kind of thing. So that CLOMAR process is where they can kind of get that pre-clearance, so they're not spending a lot of money on a development that then gets stuck in the floodplain because something on the back end happened. So that conditional process is really there to kind of help them avoid any issues later on. And then the last one is the letter of map revision based on fill, or LOMRF, LOMRF. This is anytime you're talking about fill dirt where we're raising the ground elevation, you pretty much always have to end up on the LOMAR F. Similarly, there is a conditional letter, again, where you can get that kind of pre-clearance. The LOMAR F also includes additional fees because you're essentially taking some floodplain storage out of the floodplain. So there is a fee to kind of dissuade folks from using this process. But if they don't care about the fee, they're more than welcome to get the LOMAR F and still develop in the floodplain. One of the questions I get all the time is, what's the difference between an amendment and a revision? Easiest way to think about it is an amendment is an administrative process. We're not actually changing anything on the map itself. We're not changing water surface elevations or the base flood elevations or any of the floodplain or floodway boundaries or anything like that. We're simply saying, here is some better data than what's on the map that FEMA should consider when determining if I need flood insurance or not. So the administrative process is really, we're not changing the maps at all. When you start talking about a revision, now we're actually changing how water is going to flow across the landscape. So we're maybe rerouting a stream, or you're restricting a stream because you put a culvert or a series of culverts in for a crossing or something like that. So we're actually changing the water surface elevations, the base flood elevations, the floodplain boundaries, the floodway boundaries. We're actually physically moving something. When we're talking about floodways specifically, almost always you're going to be talking about a letter of map revision. Occasionally you'll see a letter of map revision based on fill. Those are pretty rare in the floodways because it's hard to do fill and show no rise at the same time. But typically that letter of map revision is what you're going to see most often on those projects where they can't show no rise. Couple more things. So the FEMA doesn't make this process easy because the forms they require change depending on what type of letter you're submitting for. Again, for most often, the letter of map revision and the conditional letter of map revision needs the MT2 form there at the bottom. But I will say there is some good news on that front, in that Oh, I'm ahead of myself. Excuse me. We'll talk about what that good news here is, I think, on the next slide. Anyway, so for the CLOMAR, LOMAR, the letter of map revision and conditional letter of map revision, if they're going to cause an increase in the BFE or any change in the floodway that's beyond what's allowed in the state and local requirements, they basically have to get that conditional letter first. Before they submit for applications, they would go to FEMA, submit their engineering, their modeling, their evaluation of the impacts, things like that. And FEMA would say, okay, based on this information, here's what we need you to do to make sure you're not causing any negative impact to existing structures. Homars also typically require some level of community support. Now, that doesn't mean the community has to be the one doing it or that you have to agree with what they're proposing. It simply means that you're not taking a stand against it. So a community acknowledgement form is typically required when somebody is submitting for a CLOMAR, again, to make sure the community is aware of the project on the front end. Again, signing that form doesn't mean you're agreeing with what they're doing or what they're proposing. It simply means I acknowledge that they're submitting for this conditional letter. In a zone A or in an AE zone where there is no floodway, again, any increase over that 1 foot allowable it is going to require that they get that conditional letter. Now, Division of Water, we do have the ability to implement more restrictive requirements. Again, causing a 1 foot rise on a zone A in Louisville is potentially going to impact or negatively impact a bunch of your neighbors. So we do sometimes require them to do additional studies, or maybe we'll say you only get up to a 4/10 of a foot impact before you have to do X, Y, and Z or something like that. So we can require more restrictive requirements, but typically we're falling within what's allowed under the general program. CLOMAR is required for any proposed development in the floodway that's going to cause any increase. Again, remember, floodway, federal, state, and local all say, it's the area that has to be reserved to pass the base flood without any rise. So in the floodway, the engineers are going to be required to show 0.00 foot change for it to be considered a no rise. And again, remember your rounding examples from middle school algebra. 0.004 would round down, that would be considered a no rise. 0.005 would round up to 0.01, which is not a no rise. Even though they're only 1/1000th of a foot difference, rounding matters when we're talking about these models. This is the good news I was mentioning when it comes to LOMARs and CLOMARs. So as of January 1 this year, Division of Water, we've been the LOMAR review partner with FEMA, which essentially, again, means we're subcontracting, doing the CLOMARs and LOMARs from FEMA. We're still doing it to their FEMA spec, but we're actually the ones doing the work now. So if you have questions when it comes to the LOMAR letter of map revision process, or that conditional LOMAR process, you're going to be working with folks from Division of Water rather than FEMA contractors. Casey Lynn Carter, she is our floodplain mapping point of contact. So she does the risk map updates, the big watershed wide updates, and she's also the LOMAR review partner. She's the one heading up that portion as well. So you can reach out to Casey Lynn directly if you have any questions. Her email's there on the slides. Anytime you're still talking about letters of map amendment, LOMAs, or LOMAR F's, letter of map revision on fill, FEMA still does those reviews. At some point, it wouldn't surprise me if they also allowed us to kind of assume some of that LOMAR F process or something like that. But for now, we're doing all of the LOMAR CLOMAR reviews here in Kentucky. So if you have questions, you can reach out to Casey Lynn, shoot her an email. She likes to talk on the phone. She'll probably follow that up with a direct call to kind of discuss your project. But again, you're talking to her versus some faceless contractor sitting in Alexandria, Virginia, or something like that. When we're talking about changing the maps, again, whoever's the one actually applying for the permit, whoever's the one actually completing the work, they're the ones ultimately responsible for submitting that letter to map change application either to Division of Water or FEMA to update the map. You, as the local floodplain manager, though, you should help them fill out that application to the best of your ability, but it's not your responsibility. Don't feel like you have to do it for them. Otherwise, it's not going to be done. If you're the owner of that piece of property, you're the one ultimately legally responsible for everything that happens on it, whether it's your fault or not. So it's the property owner's responsibility, or if they hire an engineering firm, the engineering firm will typically do that under contract as part of that process. For conditional letters of map revision or letters of map revision specifically, the community support through that community acknowledgement form is required. Again, it doesn't have to mean you agree with what they're proposing, but if you don't have to sign the form if you're not supporting the project. So if it's going to categorically violate one of your ordinances, you don't have to sign the community acknowledgement form. Again, that form there is basically an acknowledgement, but you don't have to sign it. And then the other thing, as the local community, you are ultimately responsible for maintaining any copies of the letter of map change issued by FEMA or Division of Water, because they're superseding what's actually on your floodplain maps. Your community responsibility is to keep your floodplain maps updated and to keep copies available for folks in your community. You can file those wherever you feel is best. You can put them with your planning and zoning, or I've seen them with the floodplain administrator. I've seen some where they put it in the local library where you can check out the maps. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but they do have to be on file somewhere locally. If you don't have copies of the effective letters of map change, don't panic. You can go to FEMA's Map Service Center, their portal basically, and download all of the PDF copies. That's actually something that's pretty quick and easy. You just go to the website there, search your community, download all products. It's a very simple process, so don't panic. PJ, I see your question. We're getting pretty close to the end though, so I'm going to answer that whenever we round out to the end, if you don't mind. So just hold on to that, PJ, if you don't mind. All right. So that was how we're going to deal with our floodway encroachments. Now let's talk about some best practices. I want to show you guys some good examples of what we can do with the floodways, because I hear it all the time. I have a floodway on my property. There's nothing I can do with it. And that's not accurate. That's not accurate at all. So when they're talking about a floodway on their property, you can actually do, again, whatever you want. It is your property. The U.S. Constitution has a takings clause that basically says private property cannot be taken for public use without just compensation. The local or state government saying you can't use this portion of your property because it's a floodplain is would probably be considered a taking if we got taken to court. So there's nothing that says you can't do anything you want on your property. We went through all three levels of the regulations and kind of showed that. What they do allow, though, is we can say, okay, this is a highly risky area, for public safety or to prevent the need for our local EM to have to come in and rescue you during a flood event or something like that. We can set minimum requirements on that high risk area that you have to take. So that's really what we're telling people. If you have a floodway on your property, you can do whatever you want, provided you can show no rise. So what are some of the things that are examples of good use of floodways that are somewhat easy to show no rise for? First one is an easy one, open space. Leave it alone. Leave it be as its floodplain. That's something where, again, a walking path or something like you see in the picture there to the right. That's something that's pretty simple to show no rise. It's still a good use of the floodplain floodway, but you're not putting any additional infrastructure or insurable structures or anything like that at risk. Another example would be like riparian areas, wetlands, green sinks, and wildlife habitat. Again, kind of leaving it in its natural state. You can see this picture to the right. This is a riparian area. This is actually that green stuff growing along streams or rivers. I know it wasn't left there intentionally by farmers, but there are a lot of really great ecological benefits to these riparian areas. You're providing habitat, you're shading the stream, so you're typically seeing a lot less evaporation, again, leaving better habitat and cooler waters for fish and aquatic species. These riparian areas also will suck up a lot of the water out of the groundwater or the stream and evaporate it back up into the air. So it kind of helps keep your flood levels a little bit lower. Um, these green areas also capture a lot of maybe potential runoff. So when the farmer harvests the corn in this image, for example, those riparian areas can help prevent any erosion off into the stream by helping to capture some of that soil before it leaves the property. Green sinks are another one, so wetlands and green sinks. So this is another area where it slows water down, allows the stream to kind of dissipate that energy. It allows for water to flow back into the groundwater. Again, if it's soaking into the ground, we don't have to worry about it later when it's going to flood. It can filter contaminants. It helps pull, carbon and any sediment or debris out of the stream. More wildlife habitat. There's a lot of really great things that come with having wetlands or riparian areas along streams. Other examples would be things like for recreation. This is another really common one that you see in a lot of communities where they'll put ball diamonds or soccer fields or walking trails or things like that down in the floodplain or the floodway itself. You can see the image to the right. There's really nothing concerning to me in that image for being in a floodway, other than the couple buildings there to the far right hand corner, and then the pavilion there where there's probably a restroom and concession stand facilities or something like that. The rest of this uses, parking lot, walking trails, and soccer fields are all great things that you could put in the floodplain because there's really nothing there that's going to get damaged or lost during a flood event. Again, I mentioned walking trails is another great one. There's a lot of mental health benefits and physical benefits that come with having these walking trails, especially being near water. Not really sure what it is, but humans, we are kind of drawn to being near water at all times. And there's a lot of good mental health things that can kind of come from that. Ag uses is another one that's really common here in Kentucky. So planting, crops or tree farms or something like that in some of these areas along streams or rivers is another great use. You can use them for industrial or commercial uses. Again, if you can leave them open, that's great. So this is a picture, I believe this is actually from Ohio. It's not a Kentucky picture, but this is one where they actually were able to install their landing strip from their airport actually in the floodplain or floodway of this stream or river. So again, when it floods, this landing strip will unfortunately be out of use. But for most of the rest of the time, this is a great use that's leaving that property open at the same time. Another one that's starting to become more and more common would be like RV campgrounds, as long as they're limited stay campgrounds. Um, so limited stay meaning you pull in, you hook up with your quick disconnect utilities, you stay for a couple days or a weekend or 2 weeks or something like that, and then you pull it back home. Um, with the price of housing nowadays, some of these campgrounds are starting to turn more and more into permanent stay campgrounds. On those, you can only stay for up to 180 days. You can't have any permanent attachments, so everything has to be quick disconnect. It has to be pullable by a lightweight truck or self-propelled. Um, things like that. There are requirements, but if it's a limited stay campground, that's something that's pretty typically easy to get in the floodplain or the floodway. Really, the only thing I'm concerned with something like this would be the electric or the sewer hookups that are going to be at each site. Those are the only thing we want to make sure are protected during a flood. And then the last thing, you can still do this for now, but you can have residential structures in a floodway. Now, that's not ideal because, again, floodway is the area that floods first, deepest waters, fastest moving waters, things like that. So it's not ideal. building your house in a floodway, can put you, your property, or your life at elevated or higher flood risk than would be typical. But the property owner should strongly you should strongly be encouraged to consider alternative locations. But you can still do that right now. When our new regs come in, that is something we're proposing to not allow, meaning residential structures in the floodway. You can still do commercial structures or open space, things like that. But residential structures, again, don't make a lot of sense in the floodways. So for now, they can do that. Hopefully, in a year, that'll be a little different. All right. So key takeaways. What are some of the big things that I want you guys to walk away from this remembering? So number one, we talked about it. Floodways are the most dangerous part of a stream during a flood event. They flood first, deepest waters, fastest flowing, et cetera, et cetera. We want to try to avoid being in the floodway or impacting the floodway if at all possible. Second, development projects within the regulatory floodway have to show they're going to cause no rise or no impact. I don't really care which one, but you have to be able to show that before we can allow that development to happen in the regulatory floodway. You have to be able to show no rise. Third, FEMA does allow for those minor projects to be exempt from completing analysis. Again, upon request, just because they're installing a mailbox doesn't mean they automatically get that exemption. They have to ask for it. And if we're not certain that something is a minor project, we're going to require them to complete that floodway analysis. So again, be certain, but that is an option. And then the last one is if a no rise is not possible, you might still be able to do the project, but you just have to do the additional legwork of getting that conditional letter of map revision and then the actual letter of map revision once the project's complete. So you have to go through that CLOMAR-LOMAR process in addition to getting your permit and actually building the development. Last thing I want to tell you guys is don't panic. Again, we're here to help. My job is to be the state technical expert for everything flood related. So if you have questions, don't hesitate to reach out to me. I'm going to show you my contact info here in a slide or two. But before I do that, guys, excuse me. No, here's my contact info. So reach out to me. I prefer email just because if I'm on the road or out in the field or something like that, I can respond as I'm able, maybe over lunch or in a car ride or something like that. If you call me and leave me a voicemail, I will call you back at some point. I don't know when that'll be, because again, I'm out in the field probably a third to half of the time that I'm at work. So email me if you can. But if I'm not around or if you're not really sure who you need, you can also just email us at water@ky.gov. That's our general Division of Water contact email. You can also call our general line as well, and they will try to route you to the appropriate person. If you say the word flood and you call that general line, they're going to route you to me or David. We are almost always the ones that end up with that. But, again, depending on what you need, they'll route you to where you need to be. The last thing before I start doing the Q&A, guys, is I do want to talk about some of the upcoming training opportunities. So this was the second in our advanced floodplain management concepts webinars. So we've done historic structures last month and we did floodways today. Next month, we're going to be looking at new residential structures. In February, we're going to be talking about accessory structures, ag structures, RVs, campers, and fuel tanks. And then in March, our last one is going to be common floodplain compliance issues and how we can address them. So you can tell these are some things that aren't typical right out of the gate for a lot of newer floodplain managers, but these are a lot of great ones. And then we also have other trainings. So CAM is doing CAM is the Kentucky Association of Mitigation Managers. They're doing their regional trainings, one in each of their 4 CAM regions across Kentucky, each Wednesday in March. That would be March 5th, 12th, 19th and 26th, and they're doing them in order. So region 1 on the 5th, region 2 on the 12th, etc. In May, I'm also going to be doing a managing floodplain development through the NFIP course in Frankfurt. It's going to be a 4-day course, and it's going to be not only walking you through what your duties are and what the regulations are as the floodplain manager, but also sitting down and actually applying what you learn. That's the really important part about that course. It's not just learning what the regs are, but it's interpreting and applying those regulations then for making permitting decisions or compliance decisions or something like that. So it's really good practice for people who have maybe not had any trainings or updates in a while, or for people who might be newer to the job or need a refresher or something like that. That the registration for that will open up probably in January. And then the last one we're doing is we're going to do a substantial damage week. So substantial damage is part of all of your local ordinances as well as the state requirements. So we're actually going to spend a week going through substantial damage. We're going to create substantial damage management plans for all of the communities that attend. We're going to be going through and actually doing some exercises and scenarios where we're going out in the field, we're collecting information, and then we're going to come back to our office, which has a computer lab, and we're going to set you down in front of a computer, and we're going to have you using the substantial damage estimator tool to kind of make these determinations. So you're actually going to get a lot of hands-on, real practical practice for substantial damage. That's all I have though, guys. So I do see a couple questions in the chat. I'm going to answer them kind of in the order they came in. You're welcome to stay for that. But if you guys are not interested, I do appreciate you all being here with me today. But like I said, I'm going to answer questions, and then you feel free once I answer these two in the chat to come off mute and ask me any direct questions while you've got me. So PJ said, how common is it for a development to have a state permit but not a local? If they don't know to get a local one, and if the local floodplain didn't know the building was going on until after it was in the process. Great question, PJ. That's actually something that comes up more frequently than you would expect, but I wouldn't say it's common. Again, typically we try to do a lot of coaching and one-on-ones whenever we're talking to these applicants, as they're going through the state process. But if you ever look at the state application, one of the things we put on there very intentionally is we require the signature of the local floodplain manager. Now, that's not required by regulation. If they submit it without it, we can still, do our review. But we put that on the application specifically because we want them to come talk to you guys as the local officials before they come and get their state permits. We want them to talk to you because we want you to be aware of the proposed development, but also we want you to be aware of, communicating with them of what your local higher standards might be. Right now, statewide, you can build at or above the flood elevation. That's not a problem. But a lot of local communities have a freeboard elevation, for example, where they require you to be 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, whatever, higher than the base flood for your site. That's the kind of stuff we want to make sure you're communicating back to them. The other thing I'll tell you, PJ, is whenever we issue any state permits, you as the local official should be getting copied on that email going to that applicant. So you should see that email from our David and his staff, basically issuing those permits. You should be getting CC'd on those. The other thing Division of Water we're starting to do now is we're also quarterly, we're going to email you a list of all of the permits that we've issued in your communities. So PJ, you being Carroll County, Carrollton, and several of those communities up there, you're going to get a list from each one of those of what permits we've issued in those communities. So you should be getting one for October, November, December, and early January. That should be coming out not very long after the first of the year, for example. So that's the other thing where we're going to start trying to communicate directly to you as the floodplain manager, specifically to make sure you know of all the permits we've issued in your community. Hopefully that answered your question, PJ. If not, feel free to come off mute, but hopefully that got to what you needed. David said that's one reason to have the application or applicant acquire the local signature. Oh, David, I think you were just commenting on what I was just talking about. Yeah. So part of the reason we require the local signature is specifically so we don't avoid you guys at the local. So. And then PJ, appreciate that. So guys, that is the end of my presentation. Again, I'm going to stick around for a couple minutes. Feel free to come off mute if you have any questions. Otherwise, guys, thank you so much for being here with me today. I will hopefully have this webinar posted in the next couple weeks so you can come back and refer back to it and look at it later. But if there's no other questions, guys, thank you so much and have a great day.